My name is William Van Cleve, and I'm an educational consultant in private practice. I was asked to develop this webinar as part of my work as a writing consultant for Patent. Several years ago, I was asked to work on the MTSS Writing Committee and initially served on a subcommittee concerned with micro-level skills, including handwriting and spelling. During presentations of our product, participants engaged in substantive discussion around the areas of handwriting and spelling. As I moved towards developing content for the effective core writing instruction, it became obvious that standalone webinars on handwriting and spelling would be useful. This webinar addresses handwriting at the K-2 grade levels and can be used as an extender to the sentence level effective core writing instruction training I developed, or as a standalone. Patent's mission. The mission of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, Patent, is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. Our goal for each child is to ensure individualized education program, IEP, teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. And this is the blurb I actually wrote as an introduction to this handwriting webinar, and I just wanted to share it here for the record. As districts, schools, and individual teachers make decisions about handwriting instruction in schools, it is increasingly important to understand what the research tells us about this valuable component of K-2 instruction. Armed with the most up-to-date research, this webinar is equal parts valuable foundational research and best teaching practices. Participants will understand why handwriting instruction is important and how best to instruct students in its use. And we've got 6 items on our agenda today. We're going to look at handwriting in the context of working memory, of the scope and sequence that the MTSS Forum Group developed, and also of the Pennsylvania standards. We're going to look at what the research tells us specifically about handwriting. We're going to talk about positioning, both paper position, pencil position, as well as body position, etc. We're going to look at stroke instruction and how that works both in manuscript and in cursive. We're also going to look at manuscript versus cursive, in other words, benefits of each, when to use which and where. And then at the end, we're going to talk about some specific recommendations for teaching and learning with regards to handwriting. The Pennsylvania core standards mention handwriting in 1.4 writing. Students write for different purposes and audiences. Students write clear, focused text to convey a well-defined perspective and appropriate content. What you might notice from this is that handwriting is not specifically mentioned as an isolated skill here. However, the impact of handwriting is going to be clear on all of our writing activities throughout schooling, and we're going to look at a significant amount of research that indicates that today. This is a piece of our scope and sequence, and this scope and sequence was developed by the MTSS Writing Committee. It's a subcommittee of them, actually. It was pretty tedious work, but I also think really, really beneficial. And it will give you, it's a sample writing scope and sequence. It'll give you some guidelines and some notions. And what's important to look at as we think about this is the piece that talks about handwriting. So connections to scope and sequence, the conventions, transcription skills, and transcription skills, just for your information, include handwriting, spelling, and also the mechanics that structure our sentences, capitals, and punctuation, things like that. So in the conventions section of our scope and sequence, letter E says use handwriting, and letter F says use keyboarding skills, i.e. touch typing. We're going to do a brief sort of side mission to talk about dysgraphia, which is not the core focus of our handwriting webinar, but it seemed to be ill-conceived not to at least pay heed to it briefly. So we're just going to talk about this for a couple of slides. Dysgraphia is a writing disability, so it's a specific disability focused on the writing process or concerning the writing process. It's classified as a specific learning disorder, so it's under an umbrella category of specific learning disorders. In the recent Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5, 2013, Dysgraphia is a motor-based writing disorder that affects the quality of handwriting overall and can be seen most readily in letter formation and spatial characteristics of letters of students' writing. Further, dysgraphia can impact students' spelling and the quality of their written language composition. It often accompanies dyslexia, but it may occur alone or with other learning disabilities. So it's important to know that this is often comorbid with dyslexia, but you'll see dysgraphia in students who really suffer from no other language-based learning difficulties whatsoever. You'll also see it comorbid with a number of other learning disabilities. So it's sort of a mixed bag. It's a pretty rare situation to see dysgraphia in isolation from other learning difficulties, but it does happen. What I've given you here is a reference slide of some of the characteristics, risk signs for dysgraphia. I'm just going to read through these because this really is sort of a different topic from our core focus today. Risk signs for dysgraphia: poor fine motor skills, lack of dominance, and that's hand dominance. We're actually going to talk about that in a little while. Letter reversals beyond the early stages of writing, a poor pencil grip, spatial problems, and that's spatial problems in terms of putting text on the page. Slow rate of speed while writing, inconsistent spacing of letters, lack of automaticity when writing beyond the early stages. So our smallest, our youngest learners, they all have a lack of automaticity because they're still learning letter formations and linking them with the letter sounds and names. But at this level, it would be a sort of a student who's should have achieved that automaticity, should be faster, and has not yet developed that. Poorly connected letters when writing in cursive. Inconsistent slant of letters, and you'll see that particularly in cursive. You might even see a word with 2 or 3 different slants, sort of a left-hand slant, a right-hand slant, and straight up and down letters, all within the same 4 or 6-letter word. Excessive erasures and hand fatigue while writing. Now, it's important to know that some of these characteristics are exhibited in students who have been poorly instructed in handwriting in general, and sometimes handwriting instruction can correct some of these issues. But if these issues are truly a piece of dysgraphia in a student, the corrections in things like paper positioning and pencil grips and what have you won't speed up the handwriting. It won't make the handwriting more automatic. Writing is the act of dealing with an excessive number of simultaneous demands or constraints. Viewed this way, a writer in the act is a thinker on full-time cognitive overload. This is one of my favorite quotes in the writing research because it really shows in a pretty concise sort of 2-sentence structure what a writing brain looks like. And you have these students with multiple demands for writing anyway. We all have multiple demands when we go to write. But when you look at a student who's struggling or a student who's young and still developing fledgling skills, that child is going to have more demands on the working memory than his peers or than older students who've automatized their letter formations, etc. So you see these kids with handwriting difficulties. You know, kindergarten students to a certain extent, they all have handwriting difficulties because they're all learning to form letters, they're all learning to develop automaticity. But when you see handwriting in an older student that's a struggle, that is often the result of poor instruction or poor internalization in these K-2 years when we're really looking to develop the student's handwriting automaticity. And if the automaticity is formed correctly, what we end up with is a student who does not have handwriting hitting his working memory repeatedly. It's automatized enough that his working memory is able to work on the higher level writing skills. So he doesn't have to consciously think about the formation of letters. And that's really what we're looking for with this handwriting piece. So transcription skills, and again that includes spelling, mechanics, and handwriting, are not connected to intelligence, but difficulty with these skills interferes with working memory, preventing a student from putting her thoughts on paper effectively. So folks, this is a really, really important concept. Handwriting is not affected by, is not correlative with intelligence. You can be extremely intelligent and have very poor handwriting, and you can actually have a lower IQ and very attractive, legible handwriting. So these really, they don't match up. At the same time, a student who doesn't have automatized handwriting, whose handwriting is impacting her working memory, that student isn't going to write as well as her grade appropriate peers or her intellectual peers because she's wasting working memory on this lower level skill, this handwriting piece. Transcription skills distinguish speaking from writing and make writing a more difficult process for most. So the vast majority of students find writing more difficult than speaking, and what separates these two then is these transcription skills. Spelling, you don't have to spell when you speak. Handwriting, obviously there is no writing when you speak. And also the mechanics, those are not evident in spoken language. One essential reason for automatizing these transcription processes then is that it frees working memory for the higher level writing skills. We're not looking to make these children have calligraphy style handwriting or gorgeous handwriting. We're looking for functional, legible, automatized handwriting so that these students can focus on what matters, can focus on the higher level writing tasks. Skills required for handwriting include the planning to form letters, got to know what goes into that letter and how I'm going to set that up, the assessment of space requirements, and in my field I've seen a number of students who have difficulty with this, who seem to completely ignore the red lines that are clearly designated as margins, who might start their paper 4 or 5 lines down from the top for no apparent reason, who when they move towards the end of a line, they have difficulty knowing how much space the next word will take, and they'll often misjudge that. They'll have a word that won't, that you would realize wouldn't possibly fit at the end of that line, and they'll try to make that handle or that work. The phonological, orthographic, incoming visual and touch sensory information. So that is, first of all, I'm looking at the paper, I'm looking at the letter, that's coming into my brain, I've got to process that. And I've also got the touch sensory information, how the pencil feels in my hand, how the paper feels underneath when I go to make those letters. All those things are coming in, and my brain is processing those things. So now, the phonological orthographic loop of working memory integration. Phonological, basically, simply put, is the study of sounds, and the orthographic, that's our spelling piece. So it's turning those sounds into symbols, and we have to use working memory to integrate that process when we go to write. And we want as much of that automatized out of the working memory as possible. Automatized spelling, automatized handwriting again. And these spelling and handwriting things are obviously pretty tightly linked. The motor skills, we have planning movements, we have controlling the movements during production, controlling that hand to do the movements we want, to join letters the way we want, to make the strokes the right height or the right width, etc. And also executing the writing, so actually making that happen when I've got all my planning done. I think in the field of literacy, we all talk a lot about reading fluency, and I don't think that's a surprising term. But I think for a lot of people, writing fluency is just something that hadn't really occurred to them. And that writing fluency, it works just the same way as reading fluency. It's a combination of accuracy and speed. So we want to write our letters, our words, our sentences quickly, but we also want to write them accurately. We want very few mistakes, or as few as we can handle. So if you are an accurate writer, but you're writing laboriously slow, that's not fluent. And the reverse is also true. If you are writing inaccurately, if you make a number of mistakes, if your writing is filled with errors, but you're quick, that's also not going to give you that fluency. So you really want the combination of both accuracy and speed. So automaticity is really what we've been talking about for the last little chunk of time. And automatic writing occurs without the voluntary control. And that sounds kind of funny because we want voluntary control, but with handwriting we really don't. We want it to be so comfortable, so automatic, that it doesn't take anything voluntary to make it happen. It just does what it does. And that would interfere, if this is done correctly, if it's truly automatic, it'll interfere minimally with other processes in writing. Spelling and handwriting are required in written production, remember, but not in speech, and there's no correlation with IQ. And also remember, when written production is less practiced, it interferes with the conscious retrieval process. So even though this skill, this handwriting piece, is not connected with IQ, it will interfere with our ability to write at a higher level because we're spending that working memory on a task that really shouldn't take working memory away from the writing process. So handwriting impacts the writing process, and Steve Graham and Nancy Mather to respected researchers in the field, and this is relatively recent research. Students in grades K through 3 benefit from direct, explicit handwriting instruction, says Graham. Handwriting in students 3rd grade and below, both regular ed and LD. I think that's really important because I think we spend a lot of time talking about handwriting and the benefit for students with learning difficulties, but the research really holds true for students in the regular education classroom as well. Anyway, handwriting in students 3rd grade and below may impede text generation. And Mather says, rapid, legible, and comfortable handwriting facilitates writing production. So we're going to produce better and more. Automatized handwriting significantly improves both the quantity and quality of writing. We're going to write better and we're going to write more as a result of automatized handwriting. And Berninger and Graham found that. So this study, this is a lot of text, but let me talk to you about what they found. Berninger and Wolf, Berninger's a researcher, Wolf applies the research in the classroom environment. They make a fabulous team when it comes to research. And what they did was they took 2nd grade students, and half of them continued with manuscript instruction and half moved to cursive. And both groups showed advancement in language skills. So I'm not just talking about handwriting speed, I'm talking about reading and spelling skills. So that advancement included alphabet writing, spelling, and composing. And what they were surprised by is that this activity benefited both regular ed students and struggling or learning difficulty students. So I think if you sat Ginger and Bev down and you said, what did you expect to find? They would tell you that with learning difficulties, they knew they were going to find this growth in alphabet writing, in spelling, and in composing. But what surprised them, what was exciting and interesting in the research is that this handwriting piece also benefited the regular ed students. This study adds to the continuing body of research arguing in favor of handwriting instruction for all students. And one thing that sort of a result of the Common Core. The Common Core mentions handwriting in 1st grade print, and then it mentions keyboarding in 4th grade. And there's really no attention paid to it otherwise in the Common Core. And the Core does, in fact, though, say that this is not an all-inclusive document, that there are other things. But I think that a lot of educators are making choices about whether they should or should not teach handwriting based on standards, and they're trying to make assessments in terms of how much teachers have to teach, etc. And what's important to realize is this handwriting skill, it may not be explicitly mentioned repeatedly, but it's the foundational skill for so much that is mentioned. So without it, so much of the writing process is going to fall flat. Students are not going to reach their potential because they haven't automatized this process. Berninger says, learning to form letters by hand improves perception of letters and contributes to better reading and spelling. And in 2016, she and 2 other researchers found writing is essential for developing the networks involved in letter processing. And what's important about both of these quotes is this. Basically, if I asked half of a group of people to draw I don't know, people and houses and, you know, maybe the beach or something, and I asked half to write letters, and you tracked what areas of the brain were activated during these processes. Although both involve holding a pencil, although both involve drawing lines or what have you, the areas of activation are quite different. Because when you draw letters, you're not drawing, in fact. You're actually creating language. And your brain knows that, and your brain makes connections between the letters you're forming and the spellings and the sounds. The bottom quote says, learning to write and perceive letters during early childhood may affect learning to spell and read words during middle childhood. So you're going to get this incredible impact from these K through 2 handwriting instruction lessons, the automation, in students later on. And I think one of the tough things for these K through 2 teachers is they're developing skills for which the benefits will be lifelong. But the payoff isn't immediate because a lot of the longer writing tasks aren't really going to start happening until 4th or 5th grade. You know, this isn't at all to insult a 1st grade teacher, but 1st grade students just don't write that much. So, and that's normal and logical and what have you. So one of the things that 1st grade teachers are doing is automatizing that letter formation for later years, for the students when they're not even in first grade anymore. So the teachers won't really be a witness to the benefit. Handwriting versus keyboarding. What the research says is that printing recruits the letter reading processing network better than typing or tracing. And I know tracing doesn't address keyboarding specifically, but while it's fine to have students trace letters, the research is pretty consistent that actually having them create their own letters is of greater benefit. So when you write a letter, that is a better language connection than either keyboarding or tracing. There is also neuroscientific evidence for a writing route to reading as early as the preschool and kindergarten years. Also, results document the value of forming letters, handwriting, over pressing letters, which I just mentioned. Key touch in learning to perceive letters. So what you're finding here then is we actually have evidence in preschoolers that working on letter formation, etc., builds that language literacy link. Handwriting engages more cognitive skills than keyboarding, we know that. And this slide is more of a reference than anything. There's a lot of different research about different grades to teach different things. A lot of schools seem to have settled on a pretty logical setup, which would be to work on print in grades K through 2 and to work on cursive perhaps in the spring term of 2 and in through 4. There are definitely schools in this country and most of Europe actually which introduce cursive from the get-go starting in first grade with no detriment that's known. The research for mainstream students does not indicate that cursive is better than print or that print is better than cursive. Although there are some telling signs that in students with learning difficulties, cursive is going to prove enormously beneficial. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So even though this is a K through 2 webinar, I think it's really, really important to look at what the K through 2 payoff is later on. In grades 4 through 6, handwriting fluency still accounts for 42% of the variability in the quality of children's writing. That's phenomenal in these upper elementary and middle school students. Students' handwriting speed continues to increase at least until grade 9. And what's funny about this stat is Graham only tested students through 9th grade. He didn't test 10th through 12th graders. So it's definitely possible that they're continuing to improve their speed throughout high school, the rest of high school as well. So what you see is 7th graders are writing fewer words per minute than their 8th grade schoolmates. 8th graders writing fewer words per minute than their 9th grade schoolmates. And this tracks all the way down to the younger grades. So 3 recent studies in the last couple of years. And what they did was they took college students in a classroom and an instructor, a professor, lectured to them. And half of the students had pen and paper and half of the students had a keyboard. And they took notes. And what they found, the researchers, is that the notes on the keyboard were much more thorough and much more complete, much more accurate. The students who wrote by hand wrote less. They made some connections and things. They also they made some mistakes. But what they tested the students' knowledge of the information presented in the lecture. And 3 hours later, the keyboarders performed better. But 3 days later, the handwriters performed significantly better. And what they think is happening is that the keyboarders are in fact recording like a secretary, if you will, or like a stenographer in a court case, taking notes in a court case, that they're recording the words that are being spoken rather than focusing on the content and meaning. The handwriters, on the other hand, they can't possibly keep up with how fast the professor's speaking. So they are writing down the things they didn't know, they're making connections, they're summarizing. So in fact, they're understanding the material as they write it. And these are students, remember these studies are in the last couple of years. These are students, unlike me, these students were not born, or excuse me, these students were born in a technology age. My school, we didn't actually have computers until I was in about 8th grade. But these kids they've been set up with technology all their lives. And still, the handwriting is showing a better knowledge connection than the keyboarding. Okay, this is really, really important for our thinking about teaching. And what we're teaching and how we're teaching it to kids. 90% of 1st through 3rd grade teachers teach handwriting. That's pretty good. More than half agree that it was important. I'd always like more than that, but more than half is better than less than half, obviously. 39% of teachers said their students' handwriting was adequate. And here's this scary one. 12% believe they received adequate preparation to teach handwriting in their college education courses. And this means these teachers are going to have either better college ed instruction or the invaluable process of professional development to teach handwriting. This is not a skill where you can hand out a workbook and ask kids to do the next page in a series. It's going to require not just direct explicit instruction, but also careful monitoring as students develop things like their pencil grip, their paper position, their body position, and their letter formations. So these are just some ideas, if you will. Tactile surfaces are useful. The research is good on that. Sand trays, like the one in this picture, are good. One of my colleagues and mentors in the field, Arlene Sunday, recommends putting finger paint in a Ziploc bag, and you seal it, and they can write on that. Really cool service. The kids like it. Carpet squares, lap boards. Another thing that's great is something that some of the companies call brain freeze, and it's actually the stuff that's inside disposable diapers, and you add water to it and it makes it into kind of a gloppy substance. The kids love it. Teachers tend to actually think it's disgusting, but the kids love it. They can form letters in it, and then if you leave it out, you don't cover it, it'll dry back into the crystals it starts as, and it's reusable again and again. Vertical surfaces are really useful, and the reason is that it activates the large motor parts of the arm. So the forearm, the upper arm, these large motor pieces, they will not fatigue with letter formation. Your hand, your fingers, they'll get tired. So as much of the writing process as you can, that you can rely on the arm rather than the hand, that's really going to be helpful for the students in terms of fatigue level. So as unattractive as cinder blocks are, it's kind of funny that they make a great writing surface. So you can actually send kids to the wall and they can take 2 fingers, tracing style, or skywriting style if you like, and then can actually form letters on the cinder block wall. Also, wall-mounted whiteboards are great, and I'll actually, in a larger class where you can only put 4 or 5 up to the board at the time, you can do sort of like a volleyball rotation and send different groups up to the wall to write, and the others can be doing sand trays at their desks or something like that. So these are 2 logical pencil grips. The top one is what's often called the stenographer's grip. And I'm not going to suggest to you that you teach kids to use this. OTs may use this sometimes, but I am going to suggest to you that if a kid has already been taught to hold a pencil like this and you encounter that child, I would let that grip go. It's a fine grip. It provides the control without too much clenching and gripping, and that's really what you're looking for with this. The most obvious and common grip in process today is called the triangular grip, and you can see it in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide with a polka-dotted green pencil. The student's hand, he's grasping the pencil with his thumb and his pointer finger. Those are the I guess fingers. Thumb isn't a finger, but those are the 2 that are actually grasping the pencil. The middle finger is underneath and it's being used as a bridge. So you grasp the pencil with your thumb and your pointer finger, you bring the pencil down to rest on the middle finger. And what you'll find is that provides adequate control. It also minimizes clenching, over gripping, over pressure. You're putting the pressure on the pencil rather than on other fingers, etc. So really, really good. I spent some time looking around on the web for some things that might assist you and found some good ones, and I'll show you those in a second. So pencil grips, the rubber grips, can be useful, particularly for students who have already developed a bad pencil grip, because the problem is they've got you for instruction for a while, but unfortunately when they're not with you, either out of class doing independent work, or maybe they've got another teacher for a subject, those kinds of things, they could revert back to their grip unintentionally, their bad grip or their poorly formed grip, pretty easily. And so the pencil grip will help them remember. Rubber bands, and obviously use rubber bands in a larger classroom setting with some discretion. That could get kind of dangerous, but just wrapping rubber bands around a pencil can kind of thicken the pencil and also provide a little bit of a spring for the fingers when they're grasping. Rubber balls, the size of a bouncy ball, can actually be placed in the palm of a hand. And when they're placed in the palm of the hand, they actually help the other fingers grasp the pencil correctly. I've also, particularly for young children who clench the pencil too tightly and who may have that kind of hand sticking to the paper kind of thing, just a wadded up tissue in the palm of the hand can also help. It does something to relax the palm, the hand itself, but it also absorbs some of that moisture. A lot of instructors in handwriting use short pencils like the kind you'd see at a putt-putt golf course. And those short pencils actually kind of force the hand into the correct pencil grip because they don't have any back, the length that would allow a student to put it in a different place in the hand. Number 2 pencils are good. Pencil flip, I'm going to verbalize to you. What you would do is put the pencil on the table, and you can try this now if you like, but you'd put the pencil on the table with the eraser pointing away from you. Pencil on the table, point towards you, and eraser away from you. And what you do then is you grasp the pencil with your thumb and your pointer finger. Grasp the pencil with your thumb and your pointer finger down towards the point. And then flip the pencil around so that the eraser moves from on the table to sort of pointing at you, if you will. And what you'll find is if you do it that way, your pencil will be in the correct grip. And a lot of teachers use this as sort of the ready position when kids are starting with handwriting. It's a really great technique. So, they would come in and they would say, okay, pencil's in ready position, and the kids would lay their pencils with the erasers pointing away from them, and they would grasp the pencil with thumb and pointer, flip it around, and they'd all be in the right position. So I found on WikiHow and also on YouTube some appropriate grips with some animation and things, and those links are there on the PowerPoint for you to peruse later. So Victoria, my former student, she's actually holding the pencil correctly. I wouldn't have chosen that color of ink, but that was her choice. She's holding her pen correctly with a triangular grip. The thumb and pointer are grasping the pen, and the pen is brought down to rest on the middle finger. Her other hand is in perfect position. It's at the top of the paper, and that allows her to use that hand to pull the paper up as she's writing, because you've got an optimum place where your hand belongs for writing. You don't want to write down the page where your elbow will end up off the table or into your gut. What you want to do is pull the paper up so the hand is always in the perfect position. And this LLP is listening, learning position. There are little drawings and fun things you can use to help young children get that. But basically, you're sitting with your elbows on the table, which Victoria is. You're sitting relatively upright. She's a little bit over the paper, if you will. And your feet are flat on the floor. And you need your feet flat on the floor to anchor your body. In fact, if your feet aren't able to reach the floor, usually in classrooms the desk will be the right size. But if you're a one-on-one therapist, or if you're working in small pull-out groups or something like that, you may find that your desks fit one group of students but not the next. And these smaller students, they're going to want something, a dictionary, something underneath their feet so that their feet are anchored. Also, if their elbows can't rest comfortably on the table, rather than if they're too short, their elbows would sort of be up from the rest of their bodies. Again, that's not going to be your optimum writing position. And they'd want to have a pillow or something they'd sit on in the seat to elevate them to the proper height. In manuscript, the paper is typically slanted slightly to the dominant hand. In cursive, the paper is typically or ideally slanted to 45 degrees. And Victoria, actually, she's writing in cursive there, and her paper is slanted 45 degrees. And that's perfect for her to use her arm like a window wiper to move across the page. And that's optimum because we're going to use those large muscles, the large arm muscles, the gross motors, where we can for handwriting. So this is kind of a fun activity, and I'm going to walk you through it, and maybe you can do it even though this is a webinar. What I'd like you to do is take a single piece of paper and make the equivalent of a paper towel tube with that paper. And I'm actually going to do it while I conduct the webinar, so I make sure I'm giving you good instruction. And you want to hold the paper with both hands and hold it away from your head. And look through an object. Look through it to see an object somewhere in the room. What you don't want to do is bring it up to your face like Johnny Depp in Pirates of the Caribbean. You want to pull it away from your head, hold it with both hands, and look through it to see an object. And take a moment and close your left eye. Open your left eye. Now close your right eye. Open your right eye. And I think what you'll find is that for one of those eye closings, the object you were looking at through the tube entirely jumped out of the tube. In fact, if you haven't done this before, it may have even surprised you. Usually when I do this live, there are several gasps in the room. So let's do this one more time so I can tell you what it means. Hold that tube away from your head again with both hands. Look through the tube with both of your eyes at an object on the wall or somewhere. Close your left eye. If the object is still visible through the tube, you are right eye dominant. Now open your left eye. And folks, you shouldn't have given up just then because you're going to have left eye dominant kids too. You need to be ready for them. So open both eyes, look through the tube again, and close your right eye. If you can still see the object with your right eye closed, that actually means you're left eye dominant. So at this point, take a second and write down which hand you write with, right or left, and write down which eye is your dominant eye, right or left. And let me tell you what that means. In cursive, Victoria here is exhibiting a right-hand slant of the paper. So she is right-handed and her paper is slanted 45 degrees. I don't have a picture of this on the webinar slides, but a lefty would be just the opposite. So obviously her pencil would be in her left hand, but the paper would be slanted 45 degrees the other way. Now some lefties are trained in a variety of different ways, and adult lefties may have different kinds of grips and paper position. What's important for all of you is, regardless of which hand you write with, how you hold your pencil, how you position your paper, what's important is that you can model this correctly for students. So if Victoria is right hand right-eyed, which she is actually, if she's right hand right-eyed, she will write her letters in cursive with a right hand slant. They will slant up and to the right. But if she's cross dominant, and that means if she's right hand but left-eyed, her hand will track to the right, but her eye will track to the left. And what she'll end up with is a less pronounced slant. In fact, she may have a non-existent slant. Her letters may be straight up and down. Now lefties, the reverse is true. So if you're left hand left-eyed and you're holding your paper 45 degrees to the left, because if your paper slant is off, all bets are off. But if you're left hand left-eyed and your paper is slanted to the left, you will write with what's called a backhand slant. In other words, your letters will slant up to the left. But if you're left hand right-eyed, you're going to have what's once again called cross dominance. Your hand will swing the letters up to the left, but your eye will tend to guide those letters towards the right. And once again, you'll end up with a slant that is more up and down. What's the important piece of this? Slant is not everybody should slant their letters at exactly the same degree. What you want is consistent slant. So a student's letters should all slant at the same degree. Some students are going to slant more to the right or to the left. Some are going to have more up and down. We're looking for comfortable, legible, consistent, neat handwriting. We're not looking at something that lines up exactly with some prefabricated model. Later on, when you're thinking about this right hand, left eye, and all the stuff I just talked to you about, it's scripted here for you on this slide for you to look at later. All right, these are warm-up strokes for print instruction. And Diana King, my mentor, she discovered this first one. I think she was in Malaysia, actually, 50 years ago. And the instructor talked about tall grass and short grass. So the students would literally say tall grass as they were writing the long strokes and short grass as they were writing the short strokes. What you'll find if you take very young children and you ask them to draw a stick figure is they tend to draw from the feet up. And yet we ask them to write in manuscript, which is from the top down. So the first thing is to help them train their hands and their minds to work from the top down. And tall grass, short grass does a great job with that. Zigzags, which would create something like a V or a W. Circles, which would be made counterclockwise for a letter like A or G. Mountains, which would make you an H or an M, well, part of an H or an M. Waves, like a U. And dashes are for things like the first stroke in the E. So those are great warm-up strokes. They're not specific to isolated letters, but they get kids comfortable with the motor stroke. And you can be working on things like paper position, and for print, like I said, it would be a slide or slant. But you can also be working on things like sort of that automaticity of the motor stroke, pencil grip, body position, those kinds of things as you're doing these warm-up strokes. For cursive, the warm-up strokes are a little different. And the most important is the one I mentioned earlier too, the window wipers. And a student would sit in the perfect position, 45-degree paper, etc. And she would move her arm back and forth. And her wrist should stay stiff. So we don't want the wrist to flop around. I often tell students to act like they've got a splint on their wrist or a cast or something. They want to move the whole arm across the paper, and we call these window wipers because they are windshield wipers because they function like a window wiper would across your windows. And this stroke, it's really important with all of these warm-ups to not be concerned about being in the lines or on the lines or what have you. As my note says, relax. This is about getting your arm comfortable with making the strokes. It's not about making the perfect writing sample. So I've got some strokes that would make an M or an N. I've got some that would make a U or a W. The loops or the circles, those would set you up for things like an A, things like that. Those C's look like C's, but they also lead you to G, to Q, etc. So they're working on a whole family of strokes. So there are a lot of different handwriting sequences out there. And the purpose of this webinar is not to push you into one sequence over another. But I do want to make sure that you understand one of the important criterions for handwriting sequence selection. You want letters taught organized by motor stroke. So for example, I've given you an example in manuscript and an example in cursive. B, H, K, L, and T in manuscript would all be taught together or in the same sequence because they're all top-down tall grass letters. They all start with a single line from top to bottom. So we want to organize by that motor stroke piece. And I've given you, and you'll notice that D is not included in that. Even though D is tall in that it touches the top line, it's not a tall grass letter because it really starts like a C. It starts with that overstroke piece and then it goes up to finish the D. And that's really important for our grouping or our clustering by motor stroke. It also helps students who do confusions between B's and D's to separate those letters. So in cursive, I've given you a different family. A, C, D, G, and Q would all be grouped together because they all start with an overstroke to 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. So when you're making an A, a C, a D, and then they swing back around and they finish their letter. So for C, they swing back around and they're basically finished. For D, you would go up and come back down, etc. But they all start with that initial sort of overstroke piece. So I mentioned earlier, the research is inconclusive regarding teaching manuscript versus cursive in mainstream students who do not struggle. There is not a full-on research study that says one is better than the other. Research does indicate these two facts, though. Students should not be taught manuscript and cursive simultaneously. And students need 2 years of instruction to automatize a handwriting process. So if you're going to do print, you want to do print for 2 years. If you want to do cursive, you're going to do cursive for 2 full years. And you might do 2 of print and then 2 of cursive. And arguably then students could learn manuscript in K through 2, pick up cursive starting in second grade and continue on, late second grade and continue on up. That's just one model. There are others, but there's some criteria sort of for determining your handwriting approach. So Anita Archer mentions an approach that's probably familiar to a lot of you. You've at least heard the language. A number of people use this. Anita talks about I do it, we do it, you do it. And this gradual release of information, of teaching, is really, really important for your kids. So the first thing a teacher is going to do is not just put up an A on the overhead, but actually form an A with a document camera, actually, or on the whiteboard or whatever you're using. Form an A so the student can watch the formation happen. And as the teacher's doing that, the teacher's going to stress orientation lines. We're on the baseline, we're on the belt line, whatever we're using, and the lingo isn't as important as the orientation. Whatever you use, you want to be consistent about the language as you're helping these kids form these letters. So Anita's got a prompt there. I'm not going to read it to you, but you can look at that prompt as sort of an instructional technique as we go along. Talking through the formation of letters, the research is supportive of that as an activity for teachers. We do it. So using the verbal prompts, touch down, touch around, guide the students in forming the letter. Monitor the students' letter formation. So you're going to walk around the room and watch in a classroom setting, or if you're one-on-one, you're going to watch that single student as he forms his letter. And that's really, really important because, frankly, I could form a really good A with my foot if you gave me enough time. So it's not about the product. It's about the process. We want the students to do all the things we've been talking about correctly, but we also want to make sure that's happening, and we're only going to do that through monitoring. By the way, this may be mentioned on the next slide, the research does not support having students talk through their own stroke formation. So touch down, touch around, what have you. The students are actually going to say the letter name or the letter sound. We'll talk about that in a minute. So while it's beneficial for the teacher to talk through the stroke formations, not beneficial for the students to do that. You do it. Yeah, the research on that is actually on this slide. You do it. Have the students continue writing the letter as they say the letter name or its sound. We'll talk about which in different circumstances. Continue until the letters are all consistently formed. And down at the bottom, I said to you, the research does not support the student verbalizing this stroke. Research, by the way, does support identifying a student's best letter and asking her to identify her own as well. So you can have the student put a little check mark or a smiley face or something above her best C. Neighbors can do that. So you can look over at your neighbor's paper and identify the best one. You can also, as the teacher, indicate the best one. And part of the support of that research is that it gets students to look for and sometimes even articulate what makes one C better than another, et cetera, et cetera. They're actually talking through that process so they know, or they're thinking through that process so they know what to look for when they're forming that next letter. So there is research in support of cursive for students with language-based learning difficulties. One is that it cuts down on reversals. So not only do B and D and M and W look different, B and D look different, M and W look different from each other, they're also formed differently. So B in cursive is an upstroke letter, and D in cursive is in fact an overstroke letter. In a proper lowercase alphabet, all letters begin on the baseline. So look at that cursive A I've got there for you, and the A begins on the bottom, swings up, over, and around. So you've really got that, all the letters. And you'll see these young writers who pause between letters. And in a lot of situations, they know what the letter looks like, but they're trying to figure out where to start. And in cursive, you don't have that problem. Spelling is also better reinforced in the mind if the continuous movement of cursive is used. So if everybody would do me a favor, anybody who's listening to this webinar, do me a favor, and we're going to skywrite for a minute. And one little tip on skywriting, you always want to skywrite, you always want to trace, you always want to write in sand with two fingers together. Because if you only use one, you can actually do all of the letter formation just with that finger, like the old school finger exercises joke that we used to tell in school. But if you connect those two fingers together, that keeps you using your whole hand. So what we're going to do is, if you will, in print, I'd like you to skywrite the word the for me. And I'm going to say it out loud as we do it. Here we go. T-H-E. Now in a second, I want you to skywrite the using cursive. And what I want you to do is pay attention to the way your arm feels when you do that. So here we go. I'm going to spell it aloud again. T-H-E. And I'm hoping you can feel the difference in your arm. If you can feel the difference in your arm, what you're feeling is what we would call kinesthetic motor flow. In other words, your body is flowing through the spelling of that word. So your body is learning to spell the word. You're not relying exclusively on sight or memory or blah, blah, blah. Your body actually is learning that. And when you do print, you get a little bit of that, but it's short, disconnected strokes. You don't get the automaticity you'd prefer. And cursive is much better for that. Also, if you teach young children, you've had kids who you can't really tell in print where one word ends and one word begins. It's almost like a seek and find. And sometimes they'll even draw lines to separate the words. And in cursive, obviously, because you're clustering the letters for each word, you've got automatized spacing in that, and that issue doesn't crop up. So I'm going to share with you my mentor, Diana King's model for handwriting instruction. And what's important to realize as we start this is it can be used for print or cursive. I'm going to use it for cursive right here, but it works in manuscript as well. So my model is in cursive, but it can be used for both. So Diana proposes a trace, copy, cover, closed approach. And I'm actually, this slide is here for your reference, but I'm going to flip to the next slide and show you a piece of the handwriting paper. So in this handwriting paper, what you'll see is the first row of C's, and underneath are hollowed out ones for tracing. And what you would do if you were focusing exclusively on handwriting is you would name the letters as you trace. So we're just going to do the first three, and I can't do this on the slide, but I'm hoping you will. You can do it with your hand on the paper, on your table if you like, okay? Once again, if you're just going to trace with your hand, you want to use 2 fingers. So what I'd like you to do as you form the C's, I'm going to say them out loud, but I'd also like you to say them out loud, as silly as that sounds, because you add 2 senses when you do that. You're not just saying the letter, you're also hearing the letter, and you're looking at the letter, and you're forming the letter. So that multi-sensory approach really helps automatize. So everybody, put your pencil, or your hand, I'm sorry if you're just tracing on the table, put your hand down on the table and say for me, with me, C as you form a C, and then move next to it, C again, and move next to it, C again, and 3 is enough for what we're doing. Then look down to the next line, and that is copy. So the C's are there, and underneath those C's, the dots are there for our starting points. And you're going to put your pencil here, and you're actually going to form a C and say it again. We're going to go C, C, C. Now underneath is a little harder, everybody. So this would be covered. So you would not have any paper, any C's in front of you at all. You're going to write from memory. You can still look at your letter as you form it, but you're not going to look at any letters above it or underneath the paper or what have you. So with kids, I usually have them put a piece of paper over the rest of the copy sheet. So with no C's visible, we're going to try this again and see how our C's look. C, C, C. And now that I think about it, I probably should have had you do this on a piece of scrap paper so you'd actually see your C's, but you get the concept. Now the final thing kids really like a lot, this is eyes closed, and they'll squint really hard when they do this. If they're nervous about closing their eyes, they can actually do eyes averted, and you can teach them what avert means, and that'll work fine. But what they want to do is they want to write it using their body memory, so they don't want to look at the paper at all. And in Diana's pages, that sample page line isn't there, so there's plenty of room down there. And you would put your pencil or your pen down on the paper in that blank space with no lines. You have to do that first before you close your eyes, because otherwise you won't be writing in the right space. And you say and write with your eyes closed. You say and write C, 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 and then the kids will open their eyes and look at their products, and you'd be surprised. The C's actually look really good, typically. The students will get some pride in that, and that's a good place, one of the good places to have kids identify their best C and talk about why, and those kinds of things. So that's Diana King's handwriting approach. And even if you have your own curriculum in process, I'm certainly not saying replace a good curriculum, but I'm saying that there's some pieces of this approach that would really integrate well with most any handwriting curriculum or approach you're using with your school or your students. Particularly, I hope that you're getting out of this the value of naming the letter or the sound. We'll talk about that in a minute. But naming the letter as you write it to add those senses to the handwriting piece. So Orton Gillingham promotes something called simultaneous oral spelling, or SOS spelling. And we've actually been doing this together as we've practiced some of these things. And all this means is that you're going to name the letter, or you're going to say its sound as you form the letter. It's simultaneous. And one thing I'd like to suggest to you is I've done this with dyslexic students for about 25 years now, and the first couple of times you do this, the kids will resist. They'll say, oh, that's too many things, or I can't do this, or et cetera, et cetera. But like any school routine, they will adapt to it. It's really, really valuable. So don't give up on it too early. If I can take struggling writers who are really writing at a significant deficit, and I can have them do this SOS, simultaneous oral spelling, and get that process going, I feel confident you can do this with almost every student. So don't give up too quickly on this process. So here's the deal. There's a lot of recent research on saying the letter or saying the sound of the letter. I'm sorry, saying the letter name or saying the sound of the letter. You would say the letter name if you were working specifically on handwriting without regard to something like spelling a word, etc. So if I'm just working on learning how to form a C, it makes sense to say C when I'm writing. But if I'm going to spell something like the word cat and I want to write that word, SOS or simultaneous oral spelling is great for spelling words. But the research holds up that you would say the sounds instead. So as I'm writing, and you can't see me do this, but as I'm writing cat on my table right now, I'm saying this. I'm going at, and you're linking the spelling to the pronunciations. That's really what's going on there. So these are questions that we developed as part of the MTSS committee, and actually Cindy Goldsworthy did these questions, and they're really great for fostering discussion. So what would I recommend to you is that after viewing this webinar, you can take these questions back to a school, a district, the other teachers in your team, etc., and really have an integrated, intelligent conversation about these questions, because these questions are what will help your school or your group or your training site or what have you, what will help them sort of effect change in handwriting instruction if it needs to happen. So the first thing to ask is handwriting currently taught in grades K through 2? So that's a yes or no question. You know, what grades is it being taught, etc., etc. Is there a consistent and pervasive understanding of the importance of handwriting as it relates to the development and improvement of writing skills? This is really important to think about, because if you've got a school situation where a principal has, rightfully said, we will teach handwriting in such and such a grade, but the teachers aren't given the professional development, the research, etc., to buy in, you'll have teachers who are teaching something they don't believe in. And as you can imagine, the instruction won't be nearly as effective as it would be if they've been provided with professional development, training not just on the whys, but on the whats for this handwriting piece. So really, really important to make sure that the teachers are on board with what's going on, but also the reverse is possible. You may be in a situation where teachers understand the value of handwriting, but administration does not. And once again, the research is really going to help the administration understand this impact. So it's kind of a two-pronged piece in terms of understanding this piece. And PD is going to be essential as you go forward with something like this. How much time is allocated to handwriting instruction? We haven't talked specifically about this in this webinar, but I can tell you that short instructional periods, but frequently done, that's going to be your best teaching practice. So you don't want to do like Monday an hour of handwriting. You want to do a little bit of handwriting each day if you can handle it, and that's going to help with the automaticity and the fluency. Is there appropriate professional development in the teaching of handwriting? And I kind of touched on that in the second dot. Have these instructors who are being required to teach handwriting and who we want to encourage to teach handwriting, have they got the training they need to feel comfortable going in and doing this with kids? And does our district or LEA include handwriting in its written ELA curriculum? So, one of the things that happens in schools is different teachers come and go, different administrators come and go, and to make sure that you have a consistent handwriting instruction across teachers, regardless of who's coming in and out, and across administrators, it really needs to be written into the curriculum so that incoming teachers, incoming administrators can see that it's a valued and important component of the school, and it's already embedded into what's being taught. So just quickly, we're almost finished. I want to make you aware of some documents that might help you, and these are available through Patton. They're on the website. Team Worksheet 2 actually works on the questions that I just mentioned on the previous slide. It actually gives some space for teacher to write answers, and that kind of thing is good if you want to foster a little team meeting or a school meeting about these issues. They can actually jot them down, get some ideas down. And my experience with providing this content live is that if you give teachers time immediately after you've discussed some of the research and what have you, it really fosters an impressive conversation about the value of this. And one of the exciting things about working on the MTSS project is that when we did the handwriting piece with schools, we had schools going back and really rethinking what they'd done with handwriting because we're always prioritizing, and sometimes handwriting gets left by the wayside and not valued in the way that it should be. Transcription skills recommendation 1, handwriting. This is a single piece of paper, and it provides research. It provides kind of a summary statement and some citations. And what that's useful for is it's a simple, easy to read thing for quick access to an administrator who has a lot to do and wants sort of the short version of why this is important. Great sheet. There's also one for spelling and there's one for keyboarding. And I put the keyboarding one in. K-2 is not an ideal place to cover keyboarding in most situations, but I just wanted to mention it here. There's also a one sheet for keyboarding, and it's got the research on keyboarding and why that's valuable. So, and then I've got citations, and it's pretty much, we're in a good time frame. So I hope that this webinar has been beneficial to everybody who's participated, and I hope that you've gotten something out of both the research behind it, but also best practices for this. And I think what we found with the last webinar is it's going to be best if people have questions, if perhaps we take them later via email or something like that, because we didn't really have any questions last time. Sure, and my email is actually on the final slide here, and people can contact me there.